is powerful. The concept has clout. When applied to forms of family building, tradition verifies and vilifies. But while most of us are familiar with traditional family forms, our understanding of diversity in family life may be less well developed. I'm part of a team of researchers led by Professor Susan Golombok at the University of Cambridge's Centre for Family Research. Our research gathers empirical evidence about the experiences and outcomes of parents and children in different family types, including those families formed through the use of assisted reproduction, such as sperm donation, egg donation, and surrogacy. Our research has spanned decades in which medical, technological, and social developments have led to key changes in the ways in which families are formed today. This year, it's possible that a child will be conceived using donated gametes that have crossed national borders. Their parents might have been strangers whose co-parenting project began with a meeting over the internet. They may be parented by a single mother who's used donor sperm, or a single father who's used a surrogate. Or their parents may be part of a same-sex female couple, each of whom has a biological connection to their child, one through her egg and the other through her womb. Families formed through the use of assisted reproduction are often described as non-traditional in nature. Put simply, they're said to deviate from the traditional model of a man and a woman who have a biological connection to their children as a result of them having heterosex. This model is often held up as the ideal or the natural or the best way of building families. As a result, families formed through the use of assisted reproduction are often subject to social criticism. That their use of assisted reproduction is tinkering or tampering or meddling with Mother Nature in ways that are deeply damaging for society as a whole. And despite increasing uses of these technologies and government legislation that now accommodates their use by different social groups, these families are still at the centre of much professional, political, and public debate. This is a problem. Let me give two more concrete examples. In a recent newspaper article about funding for fertility treatment, the headline stated that the government would be generating a generation of fatherless families paid for by the public. And in a recent parliamentary debate about access to assisted reproduction, it was argued by one MP that those seeking to form families outside of the heterosexual couple would be hammering the final nail in the coffin of traditional family life. Well, the traditional family hasn't died. It couldn't have, because it's never existed in the ways in which we ordinarily imagine. It's a myth. How do we know that this is the case? We know that in some societies, no meaning is made of genetic connections. For the Inupiat of northern Alaska, for example, biological ties do not bind. Instead, family relationships may or may not be based on biology. And as the work of Barbara Bodenhorn has told us, these relationships are also not fixed. They may change over time. But we don't need to go to Alaska to learn this. Here in Britain, there are endless examples of families who don't conform to this biological narrative. Step-parents, adoptive parents, urban families, extended kin networks. All of these are examples of that. And in contrast, people previously bound by genetic connections may now experience family estrangement. And when social scientists such as myself ask young children who they think is part of their families, Rather unsurprisingly, they rarely get told a story about genetic connections. Rather, it seems that up to the age of about 5, children are more likely to use criteria such as co-residency or closeness in describing their kin. Beyond this age, and much like the adults around them, they're also likely to choose whether or not to make biological matter significant. And children are also more likely to be more creative in their language use to describe these relationships than are the adults around them. So, for example, they make aunts and uncles, sisters and brothers from emotional and not genetic ties. And perhaps most interestingly, when we ask them who's a part of their families, they often discuss their family pets. In general, it's no longer clear what genetic connections are, if ever it was. For example, it's now technically possible for a child to be conceived using the genetic material of 3 people. Recent developments in the field of assisted reproduction have resulted in a successful transfer of mitochondrial DNA. That is the removal of defective mitochondria from one woman's egg and its replacement with healthy mitochondria from another. Of course, there are other examples from other parts of the world where genetic connections are not fixed in the ways that we might assume. In fact, social anthropologists have long shown that for several societies, other shared substances can play an important part in making and breaking kin connections. In some communities, blood ties are bound up with other practices and substances. For example, the sharing of food or milk or something else entirely. What I'm trying to get at here is that the traditional family is a social construction. It's a collective myth. And as Marilyn Strathern here in Cambridge has so eloquently stated, there was always a choice as to whether or not biology is made the foundation of relationships. And in fact, when we look at the history of the traditional family, in which the biological facts are said to be the foundations of these relationships, we learn that this history was in fact rather recent and short. The nuclear family of breadwinner fathers and stay-at-home mothers in fact gained prominence in countries like the UK and the US after the Second World War and amongst specific social classes. But by the 1970s, social changes were afoot. Changes that have since led to the demise of the nuclear family, at least in terms of demographic trends. In the UK today, less than 2/3 of all families are headed by married couples. Now, this statistic indicates a significant 10% decrease in the total number of traditional families over the last 20 years. Given that this is the case, questions and eyebrows may be raised. Why are we still talking about tradition as though it's the only way of experiencing family or creating kin? Our work at the Centre for Family Research has shown that it's not appropriate or even accurate to discuss family diversity in terms of deviation from the traditional model. In fact, when we speak to the parents in these families themselves, we often find that they draw upon traditional narratives to explain their experiences, whether when discussing how they chose a particular sperm donor or how they divide up family household chores, or even how they describe their connections to their children. But we desperately need new ways of thinking and talking about families. Not because families formed through the use of assisted reproduction signal a significant shift to tradition, but because there are so many more interesting, eloquent, and accurate ways of discussing what's important when it comes to high-quality family relationships and experiences. Our research on families in which there's one parent, two parents, parents in same-sex couples, parents in opposite-sex couples, parents in which they share a genetic connection to their child, and families in which parents do not. Our research shows a rather simple fact. What matters most for parents and children is not the family structure of which they are a part, but the quality of their relationships, both with one another and with others. In a recent study in which we compared the psychological adjustment of children aged 4 to 9 years old growing up in one-parent families with children of the same age growing up in two-parent families, all of whom had been conceived using a sperm donor, we found no differences between the outcomes of children in these two family types. When we looked more closely at the factors that were having an impact on children's outcomes, we learned that stress in parenting and financial difficulties contributed to children's difficulties themselves, irrespective of their family type. So to be absolutely clear, there were no differences between these children due to them growing up with one parent or with two parents. And where children were experiencing difficulties, this was not related to them being conceived using assisted reproduction. Let's take another example. In our research on same-sex female couples who have adopted children, children with same-sex parents don't look any different from children whose parents are in a heterosexual couple. They're no more likely to suffer psychological problems. And in fact, on measures of parental warmth and parent-child interaction, we found that the same-sex male couples were doing especially well. And yet, despite these positive outcomes for both parents and children in these families, we know that society still stigmatizes them. We know this because we've studied the mass media content that's written about them. And we know this because we've spoken to the members of these families themselves. We know that these families still live in a social context in which having a mother and a father to whom you're biologically related is seen as the social norm. Where some children who grow up with one mother or two mothers are asked by their peers to explain the whereabouts of their father, or invited by their teachers to create Father's Day cards at school. Where some people experience family estrangement as a result of their choices regarding their path to parenthood. And where sometimes services are restricted on the basis of people assuming or appearing as though they're part of the traditional norm. Well, the stigma that surrounds these families, which fundamentally rests upon traditional family values, needs to be challenged. We need to educate ourselves, and if we are ourselves educated, educate others about family diversity today. In fact, this education would teach us that what matters most for children is the same in families of all structures, shapes, and sizes. That is a warm, supportive, and loving environment in which to flourish.